So, Alan, we haven't really gotten to talk about the fact, at least in a substantive extent, that the new vice presidential candidate or nominee for the Democrats is from your state. What has been the home turf reaction to Governor Walz's newfound national fame? Is it just like Minnesota nice polite clapping or snapping, or is there more of a groundswell? I'm kind of curious how the people in Minnesota are taking this sudden position on the national scene.
Yeah, I think it's the most Minnesotan response ever, which is extremely quiet, profound self-satisfaction, which is kind of Minnesota's brand, upper Midwestern Lutheranism, where you're allowed to smile for about 2 seconds, but you feel vastly superior to everyone around you because you know that you are the saved. Maybe it's more Calvinist than Lutheran, actually.
I have seen a lot of Midwest jokes, such as, that Tim Wells wasn't going to fly to DC. He was going to pack the car with snacks and set off at 3 a.m. to beat the traffic.
I mean, I will say that the whole, America's uncle or dad vibe energy, it is a true thing in Minnesota. So he's definitely not, it's not a thing that is ginned up for the national stage. It is a true reflection of how he is perceived in Minnesota. Right. And to be clear, right? I mean, there are a lot of Republicans in Minnesota who don't like him. So it's not,
I know the New York Times appears to have spoken to all of them.
Yeah. There are a lot. There are a lot. Minnesota is a much more purple state than people realize it is.
I do feel like he's like a little bit of a character from Lake Wobegon, that has kind of wandered out.
You betcha, Scott. You betcha.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson, thrilled to be back in the virtual studio with my two other regular co-hosts, Quinta Jurasek.
Hello.
And Alan Rosenstein.
Hello.
Both of them we compelled to turn off their fans to save our audio quality, so they will be gradually kind of succumbing to heat exhaustion over the course of the next hour or so that we'll be recording. So appreciate that to you all, because we've got a lot to talk about this week to dig into with you all, with our listeners. In the national security front, it's been another big news week. I am still waiting for that sleepy August to kick in where we can take a little break, and we've only got about 2 weeks left, so get on it, August. In the meantime, for our first story this week, I'm happy to bring back the much-missed, long-absent Yakov Smirnov impressions that I have deployed so often on this podcast to say, in post-Soviet Russia, Ukraine invade you! In an ironic reversal, Ukraine invaded Russia this past week, seizing substantial portions of the oblast of Kursk and surprising both Russian forces and Ukrainian allies in what appears to be its most successful military venture in more than a year. Why did Ukraine take this step, and what will it mean in the longer arc of this war? Topic 2. The X is for extremism. Since the tragic murder of 3 young girls earlier this month, the United Kingdom has been struck by violent riots, the perpetrators of which appear to believe incorrectly that the attacker in question was a Syrian asylum seeker. In substantial part due to far-right disinformation being spread on social media, including by ex-owner Elon Musk. What do these events tell us about the effects of disinformation and their intersection with political violence? And topic 3. But our emails! The Trump campaign has apparently been hacked, with internal correspondence including a lengthy vetting paper on vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance being leaked to reporters. The campaign has blamed Iran, but without any apparent substantiation. Is this a real possibility, or is it another example of the disinformation regarding crowd sizes, Kamala Harris's background, and other topics that has become a prominent part of the campaign's messaging? For our first topic, Alan, let me hand it over to you to get us started.
So as I'm sure all of our listeners are aware, there's a war going on in Ukraine, as there has been for more than 2 years. That war has almost entirely been fought on Ukrainian territory. There have been some actions in Russia itself. There's an interesting kind of Russian paramilitary group that is supported by the Ukrainians and pro-Ukraine that has made some incursions into Russia. Ukrainians have used drone strikes and other strikes into Russian territory. But largely this has been Russia invading Ukraine and Ukraine trying and failing largely to expel the Russians. This all changed in the last week as the Ukrainian army made a really impressive attack into the Kursk Oblast, which is in the northeast part of, or it's on the Ukraine's northeastern border with Russia, somewhat north and a little west of the Donbass region, which is where a lot of the heaviest fighting has been over the last 2 years. The Ukrainians have gotten reasonably far. They've captured, I think, a couple of hundred square kilometers of territory, taken something in the sort of low 70s of settlements. over. They're pretty far from Kursk, the city itself. If they get that far, that would be quite something. But that doesn't seem to be happening imminently. But it's a real remarkable change in a war that, again, for the last two and a half years has been fought almost entirely as a defensive action by the Ukrainians. So, the first question we might ask, and I'll turn to you, Scott, is so why are the Ukrainians doing this? To be clear, there's still plenty of Ukrainian territory that's held by the Russians. So why is Ukraine not focusing on using all of its forces to get that back, and instead going off on this fun little vacation in Russia proper?
So it's a really good question. I'm not sure we 100% know yet, but we can make some pretty informed guesses. And I will say, I want to point out that our colleagues Benjamin Wittes, Anastasia Lepetina, and Eric Charmela did a phenomenal conversation on Lawfare Daily on this that released just this morning when we're recording. This is a Wednesday, August 14th. Really strongly encourage people to check that out. I think the best conversation on it I've heard thus far is from people who really know what they're talking about. So I'm borrowing a lot from that. Although I have, actually find parts that's a little more troubling than I think they did. I think the number one explanation about why they would do this and do this now is because there was an opportunity. They saw a vulnerability on Russia's part and an opportunity to take an action that they saw as desirable. The real question is, why is this desirable? What does this do in accomplishing this, knowing they could accomplish this due to advance the objectives that Ukraine has? And there's a lot of different possible explanations that are non-exclusive on this one. One is just embarrassing to Putin, and it gives a very much needed win to the Ukrainians, who really have been on the defensive and have not had a good military headline in well over a year at this point, really since late 2022, early 2023, the earliest. We know the spring offensive they launched last year really fell flat. It's just become this really grinding war of attrition that is highly demoralizing, poses lots of logistical and political challenges, and this is a very useful win there while throwing a lot of sand in the face of Vladimir Putin and causing more problems for him, although I don't think anyone thinks this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back on his regime in any meaningful way, at least not at this point. On top of that, it also has the advantage of providing bargaining chips, potentially in negotiations. This is both seized territory, which as of this morning, it looks like the Ukrainians actually intend to hold on to, even though initially there were comments made by senior officials indicating they did not intend to occupy it. But they do now intend to establish some sort of security corridor along the Ukrainian border, which would presumably entail some sort of occupation. So we'll see what happens there. On top of that, they also captured lots of Russian soldiers who now are prisoners of war and can, under the international law of war, be exchanged with Russia or held to the end of the conflict. And when that happens, there are still lots of Ukrainians, including soldiers, including lots of horrendously taken and seized, kidnapped children from eastern Ukraine that have been held by Russia. This might be a useful bargaining chip for securing their return. A point that Nastya, our colleague, made on the podcast, I thought was really prudent as well, is that there's also sends a really important message to Western allies who have often been really reluctant to allow Ukraine to strike into Russia for fear of triggering a escalation on Russia's part. And this may be seen as a sign saying, hey, these concerns are overblown. You need to give us more free rein in doing this. That's a possibility. I have some more reservations about that we can dig into, but I do think that's actually probably a likely factor here, an explanation of this. And we can know that because a lot of Ukrainian officials have tied the need to do this to limitations the Biden administration has put on their ability to strike into Russia with longer range armaments. And so directly tying those issues, I don't think is a coincidence. I think it's part of the message that they are trying to sell here. The final possibility that Eric raised on that same podcast, I also think enters in here, is that this might be an important domestic political step for the Zelensky government before it can consider even entering into any sort of negotiations, something that seems very much likely to be on the table, particularly if former President Trump is reelected in the United States and assistance becomes more heavily conditioned. In that case, turning negotiations, particularly at the current moment, would be very difficult. And it gives Zelensky a big win with which he can say, we scored one last victory over the Russians, but now it's time to sue for peace. And that makes it a politically easier sell domestically for him and his government, which is a possibility. And I think is going to be true, even if that moment where they settle into possible negotiations or remain open to it really is still months down the line, which I think it probably is.
So you said that one of the benefits of doing this is that it shows to it's the Ukrainians showing the West that they don't have to be quite so nervous about Ukrainian attacks on Russia because, as we've seen, the Russian response is pretty muted. But how confident are we that that is in fact true? I mean, it seems very bad for Putin if the Ukrainians are invading Russia proper. It seems very embarrassing for him. And given that he has shown really no sign of trying to de-escalate over the last 2 years, doesn't this risk actually a huge escalation on the part of the Russians? I mean, we'll have to see, and maybe that escalation is worth it. But it seems far too early to say that, now the Ukrainians have shown that they can invade Russia with the West's support and nothing bad will happen.
I mean, to me, it certainly is reminiscent of Yevgeny Prigozhin, RIP, and his bizarro march to Moscow. After I can't even remember what the origins of the snit between Wagner and the Russian military were, but when he basically decided to turn around
the borscht supplies were running low.
Right. Yeah. I think it was actually ammunition. It's coming back to me now. But instead of marching further into Ukraine, turning around and marching toward Moscow, and much to everyone's surprise, he got quite close to Moscow, before he thought better of it and turned back around. And what that indicates, at least, is, I don't know if Ukrainian forces could hold Moscow if they got all the way to it. I assume probably not. But it does suggest that the Russian military and Russian military defenses are pretty brittle, I guess. I'm not quite sure what the right word would be. They're better situated than Ukraine because they just have more people and more resources. But it's not, a fighting force that's in astonishingly good shape. And so I do wonder if that is in play here. Although to Scott's point, I mean, I think it does raise the question of what the strategy is, because of course Prigozhin didn't really seem to have a strategy one way or another. Presumably, Ukraine has, put some actual thought into this. And there's some interesting reporting about how they decided to sort of plan this, in secrecy after worrying that the recent offensive that has sort of fallen a bit flat failed because they telegraphed it too early. But yeah, it's not totally clear to me what the aim is.
I will have to say, I think the line we're beginning to hear that this helps demonstrate that Russia won't escalate, I think is way premature. I think it's probably right. We've seen a couple of signs that Russia has not been willing to respond in a massively escalatory way to relatively small, incremental increases in activities against it directly or within its territory. And this is a significant step up in that, but not like a massive step up. And so, I'm not sure this is going to do what the Americans and others are really afraid of, which is an escalation to the nuclear level or a colorable one, something that American officials really were worried about early in the conflict, according to reporting from intelligence sources, for good reason. Not necessarily they were going to use nuclear weapons, but they were going to forward deploy strategic nuclear weapons, things like that. And that might still happen. We have seen Russia take certain steps in that direction in terms of repositioning its nuclear forces and conducting drills. I'm sure we'll see something like that, because that's in the end the threat, the deterrent effect it's relying on. This is really useful, as Quentin noted, for pointing out how ineffective the Russian military is, which is a chronic problem it can't easily solve, and a reason why this war has not gone the way it thought it would when it started 2 years ago. But Russia has a substantial advantage that once it finally gets its act together, it just has tons of soldiers, tons of money, and tons of equipment. Not as much money and equipment as it used to before sanctions, but still a ton, that it can then eventually get its act together and begin to throw at somebody. That's what we've seen happen with the whole Ukraine offensive. After the initial effort failed, after Ukraine was so effective pushing back through 2022 and early 2023, Russia finally started mobilizing huge amounts of troops, throwing huge amounts of lives and treasure at the problem at a scale that really few other states can really pretend to rival, and Ukraine probably cannot. And it's engaged in this war of attrition because it knows, probably correctly, that it can survive that for many more years probably than Ukraine can. Foreign allies balance that out, and that's ultimately the big why, the U.S. support, European support is such a big part of the calculus. It makes it much easier for Ukraine to withstand and kind of survive this war of attrition, this grinding sort of war that's turning into, and to make it more costly for Russia potentially. But the calculus there is still on the ground favorable towards Russia in the long run. And that's what makes why I think we need to be a little cautious, in celebrating this too much. Although frankly, I'm really happy to see the Ukrainians spit one in the eye of Vladimir Putin. I think it feels good. And they needed a win, and I'm glad to see them get this win. But particularly when you start talking about them occupying Russian territory, occupations are costly, expensive, really hard to accomplish effectively. I'm not sure what that advances here, except for maybe bargaining chip, using the territory as bargaining chip, a security corridor I don't think is going to be that meaningful, honestly, particularly unless because it's going to take time to fortify it in any meaningful way, like they have the front in Ukraine proper, which is what slows up Russian advances substantially, as I understand it. And so, you're really just putting yourself out there, extending resources on something that is really primed for a major medium to longer term Russian response. And Russia is going to have to respond because, again, it relies on its deterrent effect, and particularly its nuclear deterrent effect, to defend itself. It clearly does not invest very well in its conventional military forces. And so we're going to see some sort of response to this that's going to be pretty substantial, painful for the Ukrainians, and potentially complicating for the United States and other allies because it may test the limits of their risk tolerance in terms of level of support they may be willing to give Ukraine. I don't think this means we're going to tip in a nuclear war, but I do think that balance of how beneficial this step will be is something we have to wait to see in a number of weeks, not just in here now, 10 days after the operation started.
I mean, I think the other thing is also that part of the reason the war started in the first place is that Putin is, as far as I can tell, completely disconnected from reality. Like the consensus really seems to be that he watched a lot of YouTube videos about the glorious history of Russia during COVID and sort of got crazy and no one could dissuade him.
COVID was hard for all of us, Keith.
All of us got weird in COVID.
I was considering, I live in Minnesota and I was considering invading Ontario. I was watching a lot of YouTube videos about what could have happened in the War of 1812. And I figured, look, it's a couple of hours, How
hard could it be?
We'll cut off their strategic maple reserve. And my wife talked me down, but there's a certain sympathy for,
Exactly.
There's a comedy movie featuring John Candy with this exact premise, right? It's not Hoosiers. Oh, I gotta look this up. I can't remember.
Well, the best thing about this is that all American movies about America invading Canada are like really broad, silly comedies. And there are all Canadian movies about America invading Canada are unbelievably serious psychological thrillers, which just shows you how the two countries think of each other.
Yeah. But I can see how, from the Ukrainian perspective, you can say, push into Russian territory that might encourage Russia to be, more open to some kind of negotiation. I guess the strangeness, I think, of that is that Putin has shown himself to be so completely disconnected from reality that, maybe if he were a rational actor, that would be a good approach. But it's just not clear to me that he would respond to that by saying, gosh, we really should think about sitting down to the negotiating table if we're so vulnerable that the Ukrainians are able to penetrate into our territory. I don't know what that means about how he will respond, but it does seem to me that it makes the calculus a little more complicated. And yet, for all I know, Ukraine has already taken this into consideration, right? But looking from the outside, it does feel like kind of a wild card.
I will say, I think the most strategically beneficial part of that makes the most sense to me, although I'm not a military tactician, so I will put that big caveat on it, is that if you can really show Russia is unable to defend and hold its own territory, that's hugely embarrassing for Putin and a strategic liability. And you do that by doing strikes across the border. You don't need to hold Russian territory for a long period of time to do that necessarily. And frankly, if you do it strategically, periodically at moments of opportunity, then Russia, to avoid that embarrassment, to avoid the strategic costs, really has to reinforce itself all along the border with Ukrainian territory in a way that it obviously has not thus far. That makes the war way more costly for Russia. So if there's any rational element in Russian decision making, and I think there is in the end, although I do think there's a big caveat at the top, that makes the war much more costly. That's the whole point of war attrition. You want to make it as painful for Russia as possible. That helps in that regard. It's the holding the Russian territory that gives me a lot of reservations, just because that strikes him as such a much more difficult undertaking. I'll have to wait and see exactly what they intend here. Their position has already flip-flopped a little bit in the first couple of days. I'm sure it's to some extent still under consideration and development.
Do you think that your trepidation is what Zelensky's going to hear from his Western allies as well? Because you can imagine, you can imagine this kind of move again being used to bolster Western support for Ukraine, and especially important now. Presumably in the United States, it really depends on who wins the election. It doesn't really matter. That's the main determinant. But if Trump wins, this could be a useful thing to get the Europeans, to give more support to the Ukrainians. So that's one possibility. But another possibility is that sort of a bunch of very nervous Scott Andersons, are calling Zelensky and saying, hey, congratulations. This is great. We obviously want you to win. This is fabulous. But let's be real now. You're not going to actually try to hold this territory, are you?
That's the question. And I think there's kind of like two possibilities about how Western allies have engaged on this. We have to bear in mind the Western allies of Ukraine can like kind of in broad strokes be broken into two camps. You have a number of them that are much more willing to back kind of provocative military action by Ukraine and armed to that regard. The UK has been in this regard, although obviously a new government there, so I'm not sure exactly how that affects things, but that's traditionally been its posture. There's not big signs it's changed. Poland, a couple of other major allies. And then you have countries like Germany and to some extent the United States really, I think, is more in this camp, that have been more conservative, still strongly supportive, giving lots of assistance, but have been reluctant to say, oh yeah, take these arms and use them directly against Russia for fear of escalation. Or in the case of Germany, it to some extent, it's not just, nuclear escalation, which the United States is like really worried about. It's also an escalation in their general hostility with Russia because Germany has a lot of economic and other ties with Russia still, in spite of economic sanctions, although not nearly what they once did. Two possible explanations for this are, I think, one, Ukraine did this maybe with support from the British or others who were in that little more provocative camp, in an extent who was not fully aware to the other Western allies. And we do know the United States reportedly was not aware this was coming down the pike. That's something the Ukrainians really accomplished a high degree of operational secrecy on and surprise on, which is really quite impressive. And that being done with surprise, done outside the view of those Western allies, the more conservative Western allies feel like they kind of have to get on board because they don't want to undermine Ukraine. Frankly, they don't want to undermine any deterrent effect that their support for Ukraine might be having on a potential Russian response. So they essentially have to say, hey, we still have to support you. Here's our arms. We're okay with this. We like it, but they're going to have a stronger conversation behind the scenes. And I think to some extent, if this was really done outside the knowledge of particularly the United States, that conversation has to happen. Because the dynamic that the United States and particularly the Biden administration cannot accept in this conflict is one where the Ukrainians see that the way to get what they want is to start ignoring American concerns about escalation. That is very clearly the number one concern that the Biden administration has had. That's the only countervailing factor to its support for Ukraine is its fear of, blowing up the world by starting a major power conflict. So that is not something that's going to be sustainable in the long run. If that's really what happened here, I think that's a real possibility. And Ukraine needed to calculate a risk and is now going to strongly signal, but we're not going to do this regularly, guys. This was just a one-time thing. We had to do this for domestic political reasons. It's not going to be part of the equation. The other possibility is that those Western allies heard this was on the table, knew Ukraine wanted to do this, and they were kind of like, we don't want to be directly involved because we're worried about escalation, but we're going to kind of tacitly say, hey, if you want to do this, if the Brits and other people want to be involved with this, fine, go for it. Don't share your details with us, and gave them a little bit of a implicit tacit green light. And that's reflecting their current position where they say, hey, we're happy this worked out. You're kind of on your own, but no restriction on the weapons we've given you so far that in terms of how they can be used. That's a possibility as well. That would be like a more fundamental shift, in the Western and particularly the American and German position about like where the escalation lines are, assessment of Russia. That wouldn't be unreasonable. Again, Russia really has proven more escalation averse than I think people worried it would be early on. And that's also a possibility here. We don't really know. You would need to know at the highest policymaking kind of levels in the Biden administration and other governments to know which of those two narratives is correct. But that's kind of the two possibilities I see.
The UK has seen a series of pretty disturbing, violent anti-immigrant riots in recent weeks following the stabbing murder of 3 girls at a party that somehow involved Taylor Swift. This seems to have been sparked by misinformation that the attacker was a recent immigrant and asylum seeker. That is not true. But nevertheless, this misinformation traveled far and wide, and various provocateurs seem to have encouraged some, again, really disturbing violence. There are reports of asylum seekers who are, staying in various, hotels, hostels around London and around the UK, sort of cowering in fear as the buildings they're staying in being attacked. Genuinely frightening stuff. My impression is that things have died down a little bit recently, in part because there have been some pretty significant sort of anti-far right counter rallies in England and Northern Ireland both. But all of this has led to, I think, some soul searching within the UK and concern about the role that social media platforms may have played in these attacks, given that a lot of the falsehoods were disseminated over the platform formerly known as Twitter and now X, in part because one provocateur in particular, Tommy Robinson, who's a far-right activist, was reinstated to Twitter after Musk took over. I think there is a lot that remains uncertain here, including the extent to which Twitter actually is responsible. But it's definitely become kind of a focus of the UK and of European politicians looking for some kind of accountability after this has happened. So Alan, I'm curious for your read of sort of what the lay of the land is, how it seems like the UK and Europe might respond, and the extent to which Musk is really at fault.
Yeah. So this is a tricky one. This is one of those things that contains multitudes. So there are a couple of questions here. So the first is to what extent did misinformation on social media play some causal role in these riots and this unrest? Another question, kind of a subset of that, is to what extent did X's contribution to that was it special, right? Did it play a larger role than, other social media companies? And then the third question is, okay, if it did, then what do we do about that fact? So on the first two, look, it's really hard to know. I'm kind of happy to stipulate that it probably played some role, the general social media misinformation issue, and that X probably played a bigger role than other platforms. We can probably conclude that, or at least have a tentative hypothesis that that's true because of how we know disinformation spreads and the role of disinformation or misinformation or whatever. And then also the fact that for both kind of ideological and financial reasons, X has really slashed content moderation quite substantially. Again, partly because it's expensive and partly because just on some of these things, Elon Musk is simply more sympathetic substantively to the actual content, right? Fine. So what do we do with that information? That, I think, is the question. I think that it is both understandable that UK and EU leaders are complaining about this, and not just complaining, but in some ways threatening, to drag Musk in front of Parliament. I don't know if they can actually do that. I don't know what UK parliamentary subpoena law is. That would be a fun law for article. It is, or using various, UK hate crime statutes and EU hate crime statutes and internet regulations to punish X. They can do that, but I'm also, to be honest, very skeptical of that. I do think that it is just very, very tempting for politicians to use social media, frankly, as a scapegoat for problems that are, frankly, far deeper and far more difficult to solve than just social media. Now, again, this has to be done carefully because one does not want to blame the victim here. This person was not an immigrant. And maybe more importantly, even this person was an immigrant, that itself also isn't that meaningful. There are many. Well,
yeah. I mean, I should say it seems like there's an interesting level here where, so apparently UK courts don't usually release the names of minor defendants, but a judge did in this instance because of the disinformation. So the attacker was a minor. His parents were immigrants from Rwanda. He himself was born in the UK.
Yeah, and my point is simply that the discourse around this, just kind of apropos of nothing, the discourse around this strikes me a little bit back like in the 2008 election when there were all these questions about whether Barack Obama was actually Muslim, and the argument was, don't worry, he's not a Muslim, which was he wasn't a Muslim, but also who cares, right? That's actually not the point here. Even if he was, that should be fine in America. I think it's a little bit like that too, right? This attacker was not himself an immigrant, but even if he was an immigrant, that itself does not suddenly tar the rest of immigrants in the UK and the EU. So I do want to kind of emphasize that fact. At the same time, it is true that the UK and the EU have larger problems with, however you want to call it, assimilation of their immigrant communities, or the relationship between certain immigrant communities and certain native-born communities, or you could just call it problem with certain native-born communities dealing with the realities of immigration. They just have bigger problems than we have in the United States. And obviously, it's not like we don't have problems here. And those problems need to be addressed at the root cause. And, the EU and the UK and the EU have to really think about how to do that. And it's very tempting, I think, to say, well, actually, we don't have to worry about that because really everything is fine. We can be as progressive as we want to be. And if only X had better content moderation, we wouldn't have to deal with these issues. And so I think there's a real concern about distraction. The other big problem, of course, is, as an American, I quite like our free speech norms. I'm a fairly straightforward and unironic admirer of the First Amendment. I think that our standards for what counts as incitement are appropriately high. That is clearly not the case in the EU and the UK. Like, they do not use the Brandenberg standard that we use in the United States. And while they're allowed to have their own legal system, and they're allowed to have their own jurisdiction, and if they want to ban X from the UK or the EU because, they're not taking, X isn't taking the actions that the Europeans would prefer, they are within their rights to do so. But I will simply say, there are a few things that make me sympathetic to Elon Musk, but, the UK posting these sort of literally Orwellian, be careful what you post tweets, themselves on X is one of these things that makes me very grateful that we have a First Amendment and that X and almost all of Silicon Valley are US companies.
There's an additional layer here, which is that Thear Bren, who is the French EU commissioner who's leading up DSA implementation, who is the person who keeps sort of posting these very dramatic letters to Musk saying, govern yourself accordingly. The Financial Times reported that he did not actually get approval from the European Commission and from its president, Ursula von der Leyen, before sending that letter, which I think is consistent with the impression that I have heard in some circles that a lot of this is kind of Thear Bren enjoying posturing as the anti-platform avenger rather than a more systematic sort of European effort to rein in platforms. Obviously, that's itself complicated because I'm sure the European Commission is also keeping its eye on the fact that Trump could be reelected and not wanting to upset the apple cart too much in case of that. But I think it is worth kind of noting that this may be more like one guy's weird crusade than sort of well thought through policy effort on the European side.
But he doesn't speak for the UK, and the UK has been very upset about this as well. So it's not just one random European guy.
I have to say, I have a kind of different set of instinctive kind of preconceptions about this than you do, Alan.
Well, I look forward to hearing how you're wrong.
Yeah. So there's this idea that the First Amendment that we have, which is incredibly broad, kind of the broadest set of speech rights we have, and has been kind of, if anything, kind of ratcheted broader or largely insulated with a couple of very small exceptions for the last, 3 different Supreme Court kind of regimes, Roberts Court, Berger Court, Rehnquist Court, in part because it's like this subject of kind of bipartisan pan-ideological consensus that we like this really robust First Amendment. And that's inherently a good. I think there are a lot of really good parts of it, but there are costs of it, and different sides are going to strike those costs reasonably. And I'm not sure that it is categorically impossible to strike a formula that can take care of some of those negative costs in a way that doesn't still preserve the substance of that right. It's hard to do in the American context because the First Amendment right is worded very broadly and is just one big amendment. So parsing it much more narrowly than that doesn't really make any sense from a constitutional interpretation perspective. But I don't think that means that that formulation is correct from a policy perspective or optimal. And I don't think it's impossible that the European state could strike a more optimal line on this. Here we're seeing real negative externalities of the hands-off regulatory approach the First Amendment obligates the United States to pursue when it extends to other countries. Disinformation spreading is harming people genuinely, right? And there is a nexus where even U.S. law would allow some degree of regulation. So let's see a platform was being used to actively promote violence, right? Like being used to direct and identify who should be targeted things. That is a situation where I think it's context specific, and the First Amendment would still be a very serious concern. But you can see scenarios where even that would survive First Amendment scrutiny if applied narrowly and judiciously in truly exigent circumstances in the United States. That seems to be really what we're targeting here. Maybe 1 degree slightly removed from coordinating violence to directly instigating and promoting violence. And those are incitement laws that European nations have had on the books for a long time in the terrorism context and a number of other contexts. Like most European countries have incitement laws on their books. And I don't think any of them have succumbed to being a free speechless society, to say the very least. And I have to wonder here, when you're specifically talking about platforms that can be used for all sorts of purposes, whether we're going to see a kind of USB-C type effect with Europe, where Europe being a big market drives adaptations that the United States, because of its handoff regulatory posture, can't really compel. I say USB-C because there's a classic example where Apple and lots of other companies are gravitating toward USB-C as a uniform kind of format for cords because you kind of insisted on it, right? And I wonder if we might see you could see the Europeans do something similar to social media where they say, look, if you want access to European markets reliably and consistently, you're going to have to do something about disinformation, particularly where it intersects with violence and it really harms underprivileged or vulnerable populations. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing if that's what the Europeans do. And particularly the benefits redound to the United States, because often it's in the interest of these big companies to try and have one standard that applies worldwide. And the alternative to that is, maybe Twitter refuses to comply with that. We see it stick to its current kind of extremist, absolutist free speech kind of angle, if that's what's happening with it. It's a little not quite 100% accurate, but that's how Musk, I think, would frame what he's doing. And then all of a sudden Twitter's not on European markets. And all of a sudden maybe Twitter's not the public square it once was. And that it still kind of is. Like, I'm still astounded by the extent to which media, in particular in the United States, really still turns to Twitter more than any other social media platform. Maybe that will be what finally breaks it. And it strikes me that's just, the consequences of Musk's actions and the policies adopted on Twitter. I don't have a problem with that. So I guess why is that objectionable to you, Alan? Like, what are you concerned about? Why is it you think the First Amendment protecting Elon's ability to allow this sort of conduct on his platform is inherently a good thing?
I do think that it is important that we not jump in here before we know whether or not X actually contributed to this problem. Like, this is a continual problem where people are very quick to say riots happened, people posted about the riots on social media platform, therefore the social media platform is responsible, as Alan was saying earlier. And we do not know that to be the case. Now, that doesn't mean that Twitter shouldn't be doing a better job moderating this stuff. Like that, I certainly agree, but I just want to be very, very clear that the causal mechanisms here are not clear at all. And so I do think that is worth underlining. I will say to your other point, I mean, there's already, I've imagined, Alan, you may have heard this too, a lot of conversation around a quote unquote Brussels effect, which is basically that, DSA implementation may push platforms to sort of self-regulate more within the United States. I think the problem with that in the Twitter case is that Musk is clearly someone who thrives on confrontation, and I'm sure he would get a kick out of being limited in Europe for whatever reason, because he seems to have no problem with just burning money. And so I'm not, again, as with Putin, I'm not sure if the incentives work quite the same way for him that they would with a normal company.
Although it would say, I think the real reaction there is how useful is Twitter if it becomes a US only platform, and that, or a predominantly US platform. I think a lot of the big markets that keep Twitter at the center of the social media universe, where I think it still lies, although it's much less of a prominent position than it was 3 years ago, is because of, global media and people who care about access to international audiences. So that was my drive there, not necessarily Musk directly, but the appeal to the consumer for Twitter.
So, Scott, I mean, to your point, I try not to be too ideological, which is to say, I think all these questions should be thought of at the margin, right? Which is, how much does that additional bit of free speech get you in terms of the benefits of free speech versus the cost of free speech? And so you're totally right. Like, there's a point at which it becomes negative, right? The costs outweigh the benefits. And we recognize that in US law, there are plenty of restrictions on free speech. The Brandenberg test, right, which is that, it's kind of classic example that incitement to violence can be criminalized if it is, oh boy, I'm going to get this wrong. If it is like threatening imminent lawlessness that is like directed, I wrote a whole
likelihood of imminent lawless action.
I wrote a whole large article about this. So I feel like I should know this better than I do, right? That, you're allowed to criminalize, and then all these cases about where exactly that line is, right? Now, is that the quote unquote right line? I mean, I don't know. I think it is. But the question is, do I think it is because I really have some independent theory for why it is, and I've done the empirical research, or because I'm an American who has been raised in a particular free speech culture, and it's just like the water in which I swim, and I'm just comfortable with it, and that's colored my view. I don't know how to disentangle those two things. I'm not sure it matters. At the end of the day, I sit where I sit, and I like that First Amendment perspective. And so, to be clear, I never said that I don't think that the UK or the EU should be able to enforce their laws. I'm a big believer in national sovereignty. I think they should be able to do whatever they want. I'm just glad I don't live there for this purpose, right? Because I just don't want to be in a world in which, Elon Musk tweeting, man, it looks like the UK might be heading towards a civil war, is an example of potentially a criminal disinformation. Like, that seems insane to me. You're right that the EU and Europe and the UK have had much different standards than the US has had for many years, and they're not a free speech list zone. I think that's true, but they're a less free zone when it comes to speech. Again, that's not the be all and end all, but I think the sorts of things that can get you in trouble in Europe, they're a problem. They're a problem generally. And I also think they're a problem because one of the, and this maybe gets back to the original concern of using X as a scapegoat for deeper social issues that the Europeans have to work through however they work through, is one of the benefits of really robust free speech protections is that it ensures that social problems are not submerged for too long because the government cannot repress them. People can just say what they think, no matter how offensive it is. And because it's out in the open, it stays on the agenda, right? And it cannot be ignored. I suspect that there is a decent amount of sort of suppression, whether legal or non-legal, of anti-immigrant views in Europe. And I don't agree with those anti-immigrant views, but I don't think the suppression is terribly helpful because it puts off the day of reckoning of how you deal with those profound social issues. So again, I'm happy in any particular instance to litigate, whether or not this or that piece of disinformation should have been taken down, or whether or not this or that particular EU or UK legislation is appropriate or not. But I just don't have a lot of confidence that the response here from the Europeans is not going to be very heavy-handed, very overreaching, in a way that when you implement it, and this is always the problem with trying to criminalize disinformation, which is that you don't criminalize disinformation, you set out some rule that then companies have to implement, and inevitably they over-index on that because they don't want to get in trouble. And the question is, how much collateral censorship do you get? And if you're going to yell at Musk for saying, I think the UK is in the middle of a civil war, right? If you're going to operationalize that, the amount of censorship or moderation, however you want to call it, that you're going to need for that is just enormous. And I think in a liberal, free, expressive society, that's just a bad thing. But a bunch of Europeans are listening to us and they want to disagree and they say, oh, you barbarian American. I don't really have an obvious response to them, except that this is one of these things where, in the broad course of history, you look back and you see which society was ultimately better. And I don't know. This is another example. What is it? Was it the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai, when asked what the effects of the French Revolution were? He said it's far too early to tell. I mean, it's a similar thing with free speech cultures. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a metric along which you can rate societies as better.
I'll just say the only other aspect of this I would highlight is that the United States doesn't leave the speech. I don't think anybody's talking about the civil war is coming in the UK, a clear statement of opinion. I think we're talking about Musk and other people actively reporting false information, right? There's a story where Musk reiterated.
But why aren't we saying that? Like he is being raked over the coals, and I think in part threatened to be dragged in front of Parliament because he says shit like the UK is going to have a civil war.
That's
literally not what's happening.
Yeah, it's not that he personally said something. I think the argument is that he purchased a platform, removed all of the content moderation capabilities, and redesigned it to surface incendiary material, including by letting back on incendiary voices who had previously been banned for breaking the platform's rules. It is way more than just a rich guy having objectionable views. I mean,
fair enough. But I will say, as someone who never thought that, fine, I'll take the bait. I never thought Donald Trump should have been kicked off Twitter. And so, I guess I also think that, letting back people who say inflammatory things is, as much as I don't like those people, I don't know, in a world where we like speech is a good thing. Now, again, you can disagree with me, but I will stake that position.
If you're talking about actual misinformation and disinformation, that is not protected speech in the United States in an absolutist sense because we have libel and slander laws. We have a mechanism by which people can actually push back and impose sanctions for expressing that speech. The difference is it can't be done by the government. It's done through civil litigation. And that kind of gets at my fundamental problem with this sort of space.
But that distinction doesn't quite work because the First Amendment also limits the extent of libel and defamation. So it doesn't quite work like that, right? But I'll take your point that it's not an absolute.
Let me finish what I'm laying out. The delta here, the actual speech that is the core of the policy concern as I understand it, which is things like that Musk has been personally involved in, but is also much more prominent on his platform, which is headlines saying that, they're setting up detention camps in the Falkland Islands for far right-wing protesters, right? Which is an actual headline that Musk himself retweeted and amplified for several days before finally removing it. Those sorts of false claims, false statements can be the basis of civil liability and substantial sanctions in the United States. but they can't be the subject of government regulation very easily without that nexus to incitement, right? Which is the line. That is the unique product of the way the First Amendment works in the United States.
No. But Scott, you're wrong. You're wrong, right? Because, for example, you cannot bring civil liability for incitement. Like, this is the Claiborne case. You cannot bring civil liability for incitement, just a tort suit, without satisfying the Brandenberg test. So you are right that, like, there is a difference between civil liability and government censorship. But even in the United States, it's actually, the First Amendment really is a very profound limit even on civil liability. I mean, I think we're getting bogged down in the details a little bit.
You can bring slander and libel cases for things other than incitement to violence.
No, that's true. But you said incitement.
I'm saying you can't have government regulation unless it hits that incitement line. In terms of civil liability, slander and libel can be used to a much broader range of speech than is subject to government regulation.
Slander and libel, yes.
So, on that framework, this is not speech that we recognize as being free of restrictions, free of constraints, free of potential consequences and sanctions of using. The question is, we don't trust the government to make those choices, and other states do and might, or at least they don't have any legal restrictions on it. And I'm particularly from that perspective, when you're talking about speech where both legal systems agree that there very well could be problems for it, and it's okay to sanction people for saying it. The preference we have for civil litigation as a mechanism for that, which has lots of, uneven consequences. It's easier to be rich. It's easier to be a lawyer and pursue those consequences. We're only seeing it deployed, effectively against disinformation in the last few years because it took a long time to set up systems to actually be able to pursue it. And even then it's like more high profile cases than systematically. To say that, well, maybe civil litigation isn't the way to do this. Regulation's a better way to do it. That's something we do in lots of other areas of law in the United States. But here we can't because of the First Amendment. The fact that other states would choose to make that choice just strikes me as a very plausible and reasonable, shift in regulatory approach and strategy that for countries that don't have that historical First Amendment restriction as broad and restrictive as it is here.
But again, I don't think you're describing the U.S. system correctly, though. So let's take a specific example, right? The one you used about like a bunch of lies that they're going to put right wingers in jail in the Falkland Islands, right? That's not slander or defamation against anyone. I mean, against the government, but you can't slander or defame the government. That's not how slander or defamation works, right? So in the United States, that would not be an actionable statement. The government couldn't do it because of the First Amendment, but a private individual could not, for example, bring a negligence suit for some consequence of some inflammatory statement about, the government holding right wingers in jail in Alaska. And the reason they couldn't is because the First Amendment would block that. So I just think there are actually substantive differences between the two legal regimes. Now you can say, well, I think the American legal regime is just incorrect, right? And look, Marianne Franks, who's a law professor at GW, wrote a book called, I think, The Cult of the Constitution a few years ago. And it's like a pretty broad, I don't want to say it's not an attack on the First Amendment. That's very unfair. But it's like a very broad criticism of mainline American legal thinking on the First Amendment. And she just says, we fetishize free speech and it is just a bad thing for, for largely marginalized communities, right? I happen to disagree with that book, though it's an interesting book. And I sort of, respect Marianne as a scholar, and it's a sort of coherent position to say. But there is a substantial difference between American and European speech cultures. And so, I don't think that the Europeans are just trying to do something that the Americans are close to doing. They're really trying to do something very, very different. And I think that would lead to a impoverished speech culture, or already has, that is not worth the costs. But of course, I live in the United States, and so I can think that and whatever.
Well, talking about free speech issues, let's get to some internal speech that's become a little too free and out in the public square, at least for the likings of the Trump campaign. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen, I think just last week actually, we have seen a really interesting story come out where Politico, I think, was actually first to reveal that they had been given files from the internal correspondence of the Trump campaign by an anonymous individual who I don't think acknowledged they were a hacker, but is strongly believed to be a hacker. The Trump campaign then came public with saying they had in fact been hacked, quickly blamed Iran for the hack, without ever being really able to point to any clear evidence that they were the ones directly involved. Instead, they pointed to a Microsoft report suggesting Iran was engaged in activities intended to sway the results of the 2024 election, something Iran has been accused of by various people in the past. So it's not entirely surprising if that might be the case. but nonetheless has essentially positioned itself as saying, we have been the subject of this targeted hack, painting it as Iran, and underscoring it, framing it in terms of Iran being afraid of the Trump administration, and this being an effort to somehow support the Harris campaign. At the same time, we've seen the Trump campaign engage in a lot of disinformation in a lot of other regards, or a very selective portrayal of information, whether it is criticizing or at least amplifying criticisms of Kamala Harris's crowd sizes at different rallies that she's held. In particular, a criticism launched, I think initially by Dinesh D'Souza, saying that a reflection in the airplane suggested that there was not in fact a crowd there, and that the image had been digitally altered. That was amplified by people close to Trump, maybe Trump himself, I can't recall exactly, on top of a lot of questions about Kamala Harris's background, professionally, personally, in a lot of different regards. We're seeing a familiar pattern in this campaign that's very reminiscent of 2016 and 2020, but now kind of going in a different direction, at least on the hacking front. And it's creating a very complex information environment. Quinta, let me turn to you first on this. What do we make of these sorts of stories that are developing side by side? What does it tell us a little bit about the presence of these election interference challenges and disinformation challenges that we're so familiar with from 2016 and 2020, but really have not gotten the same degree of public discourse, I don't think, this election cycle, at least as of yet? How, still prominent are they, and how much have we found ways to deal with them that might be deployed now that weren't there to the same extent in 2016 and 2020?
So ever since 2016, there's been sort of an apparatus that's been built up across the government and sort of various arms of civil society, including social media companies, threat intelligence companies. I think I would include the press as part of this, independent researchers, to identify and respond to foreign election interference. We saw that kick into high gear in 2020. I think it was more or less successful. There was not any particularly prominent meddling in that election from foreign actors. Listeners might recall there was a sort of a weird incident where I believe Iran-linked hackers attempted to access a Florida voter database and emailed Democratic voters pretending to be the Proud Boys and threatening them to vote for Trump. Not super clear what the goal was there. So as you say, this is really a repeat in some ways of what Russia tried, or Russian military intelligence specifically attempted and succeeded in doing in 2016 in hacking the DNC, the DCCC, and the Clinton campaign, and then releasing that information through WikiLeaks. And that is not just me saying it. Chris Krebs, who's the former director of CISA, said on Twitter after this news broke that, and I quote, "Someone is running the 2016 playbook." I do think it's worth noting that in 2016, while Russia did breach Democratic Party and Clinton campaign systems, there was some reporting that they also attempted to attack the RNC and were not successful. In this case, we do have some information indicating that these hackers who Microsoft has indicated are connected to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps attempted to attack both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign. The Harris campaign has said that they're not aware of any breach. So I think, we're already kind of seeing in motion how various institutions are and aren't putting into play the lessons that they learned in 2016. And I should say I have a piece on this that, dear listener, when you listen to this on Thursday, may already be available on the Lawfare website. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the intelligence community responded way more quickly. Intelligence community and threat intelligence analysts responded way more quickly here than they did in 2016. In 2016, I think the CrowdStrike report attributing the hacks to Russia came out, I want to say in August. The intelligence community didn't weigh in about Russian election interference until October, which kind of stunned me when I looked at that and saw just how long it took them. This time around, so we had this Microsoft threat intelligence report, which I should say I think there's good reason to believe is reliable and that this really was the IRGC. That came out shortly before Politico reported this story. And then the FBI confirmed that it was investigating Iran-linked hacks only a few days afterward. That is like lightning speed. And I think there really is a sort of a lesson learned here in terms of the intelligence community feeling that it really needs to, get out in front of the conversation and be open about what it knows about what's happening behind the scenes. I also think that we're seeing press organizations respond very differently. So one of the big black eyes for the press in 2016 was the way that after WikiLeaks published sort of these tranches of documents hacked from the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign, the mainstream press, particularly the New York Times, really kind of went ham on them and just started reporting every single detail. I think the most notorious is there was an article, I forget in which publication, about, John Podesta's risotto recipe. Just really kind of digging into this, really feeding into the Trump campaign's attacks on Clinton and kind of just reporting on all of these documents without any real care in distinguishing what was and wasn't newsworthy. And what we saw this time was that Politico, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, who all said that they received this information, published stories saying, hey, we received this information. It seems like it's the IRGC, without releasing anything beyond the very, very broadest details of the information that they received. And I know that has been frustrating some more Democratic aligned commentators, but I do think that that is really best practices. The story is the hack, less so the material that was released in the hack. I think it will be interesting to see whether these outlets end up deciding to publish anything about the material they received. Because I do think that, if you receive something that is hacked, but that you'd believe to be genuinely newsworthy, I think that's a difficult call. But ultimately, I would say, yeah, go ahead and publish with adequate context. And so I think, we're in the opening stages here. I would not be surprised if there's more to come from the IRGC. I would not be surprised if they end up posting this information themselves online or handing it to an outlet with fewer scruples. And then I think that's really going to be the sort of acid test for the press.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I hope, and I'm maybe this is too naive, it's almost certainly too naive, is if maybe this is finally the thing that creates a bipartisan consensus that foreign intelligence hacks are bad. One thing that I will notice from the Harris-Walz campaign is that there has not been a Iran, if you're listening, moment yet, which is good. The couch thing was one thing, but I'm glad that no one's screwing around with that on the Democrat side. Obviously, it's pointless to hope that, Trump is deeply regretting back in 2016 his comments and things of that nature. But I do wonder, and I'm curious, Quinta, what your sense is if we're finally getting to the point where both parties recognize this is a big problem and that this is just something that always needs to be condemned when it happens and not tried to be exploited for sort of political points? Or do you think that I'm being far too tenderhearted and in 2024 that's naive and hopeless?
So let me take a step back and actually broaden the question a little bit here, because I think we can all agree on the foreign intelligence element of this, right? But right now we have circumstantial evidence, fairly strong circumstantial evidence. If the Microsoft report is treated as credible, it seems like it should be, but still just circumstantial evidence that this was actually Iran or even a state-backed hacker. There are private individuals that might have every incentive to try and accomplish this. And there are private individuals and groups that might have the capability to accomplish something like this. Does the calculus change if it's a disgruntled American on the reportability? I mean, does that require a different standard? Are we saying that all hacks of all ways should be treated this way? Or is it specifically where there's a risk, particularly maybe it's election related hacks, or is it the foreign intelligence element that actually matters? I'm quite curious because this is always talked about in context of foreign election interference, but it could be domestic election interference. And so does that change how we should approach it or think about it as a policy perspective? Given that a lot of cases, we're not going to know which is which, at least in the early days, until we have some sort of attribution.
Right. So out of the gate, I think it's important to underline, initially it was really not clear what was going on. I think that as the evidence has mounted up, so someone at Microsoft gave an anonymous comment to the Post saying that their report was specifically talking about an attempted hack of the Trump campaign. Roger Stone has said that Microsoft alerted him a few months ago that his personal campaign had been hacked, which aligns with the senior campaign advisor referred to in the report. We now have this FBI investigation. And importantly, there hasn't been any reporting that any intelligence agency or threat intelligence group thinks this isn't Iran, which I think is actually a pretty significant sign. So, like, it's Iran. Whether or not people are going to say that 100%, it's almost certainly Iran. That said, I think that you make a very good point. For better or worse, we have different standards for how we respond when we see attempted foreign interference versus attempted interference from, a disgruntled domestic actor, right? Whether or not that is the right way to think about it, I think, is an interesting and super complicated question. But it is absolutely true that, journalists get information from weird sources all the time, right? The sort of classic example is in the Watergate investigation. Deep Throat Mark Felt was an FBI official who was talking to Bob Woodward because he was annoyed that he had been passed over for the top job, right? No one's hands are super duper clean here. And so it is always a process of weighing the information that you received against the motives of the person to give it to you, and making sure that that information is authentic and that the person isn't just trying to, pull a fast one on you. I think that is sort of the key here. And I think there is also, a strong point to be made that, look, for all the sort of hand-wringing about foreign election interference, the real threat, as we all saw in 2020, is interference coming from one of the political parties, by which I obviously mean the Republicans, in efforts to sort of destabilize the vote, cause chaos, cause people to doubt the integrity of the election. And so, I think it's tough. I think it is kind of easier to draw that line and say we should be extra super duper careful when it's a potential foreign influence operation, because this is a project of, Americans making a decision about who will lead this country in particular. And so I think you can fairly say, it's particularly important to guard against that foreign interference. But, we also look at the kind of stuff that the Nixon campaign pulled in trying to ensure his reelection in 1972, and, look askance at some of the dirty tricks that were played there, right? So there are norms that need to be enforced in both the sort of foreign and domestic part of the spectrum. And I do think that it's appropriate for reporters to sort of tread carefully when it comes to thinking through these things.
Well, folks, that is all the time we have to discuss today, but this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come until we are back in your podcatcher. Alan, what do you have for us this week?
So I'm a big fan of the Substack newsletter, both as a genre and an institutional form. I subscribe to lots of them, but I only pay for...
How goes the rosy view, by the way?
Oh, God. The rosy outlook, frankly.
Rosy outlook, excuse me.
Yeah, sadly it is. Sadly, it turns out, starting a Substack and having two tiny children, and being a guy who likes to, who needs 8 hours of sleep a night, though, you can't do all those three things at the same time, as I have discovered. So it's a little dormant, but, one day. I don't want to cut into my lawfare time. So I subscribe to a lot of Substacks. I only pay for a couple of them. And one of the ones that I pay for is Noah Smith's excellent Substack. And he's just really good. It was reminded to me of how good it was when he wrote a piece. This is like a random piece he wrote. There's nothing special about this particular piece, but it's very, typical of, why did America fall behind on battery technology? Which is the sort of really interesting, important, and kind of wonky question that, it'd be great if someone explained to me at some point. And he did, and it was great. And, he writes 3 of these things a week, on a whole variety of, themes. And I like his kind of approach and his sensibility, as they say. So, this is not the most, I think, exciting of object lessons, but I think it's a really good Substack, and it is worth your $5 a month.
Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I have an article from the University of Florida student newspaper, which is delightfully called The Alligator. Less delightful is the substance of the article, which is a truly anger-inducing report on just how profligate former U.S. Senator Ben Sasse was in his brief time as the university's president. So Sasse was only in office for 17 months. He stepped down recently. And according to this really impressive piece of student journalism, he tripled his office's spending, including sending millions of dollars to a consulting contract with McKinsey, for sort of management style training for him, hired a bunch of his aides from his time in the Senate and massively increased their salaries. There's also some notes about the fact that most of those staff were working remotely, including some of them from DC working remotely at the University of Florida. And so SAS here, let me see. A partial report says that SAS spent over $20,000 between April 29th and July 29th to fly his employees to campus. Again, this is a public university. They could use this money to do things and, make life better for the students, maybe hire some professors. But no, he spent $17.3 million in his first year in office, and none of that appears to have anything to do with actually the work of education. So this is truly mind-boggling. I think it deserves to be a much bigger scandal. It is another example of really impressive reporting by student journalists, which I think always deserves to be highlighted, and is yet another example of the long, long, long fall from grace of Ben Sasse, who once, let us not forget, wrote a book called The Vanishing American Adult.
I will say, and I am not a fan of university bloat and unnecessarily spending. I truly wonder if you were to go and compare what a lot of other public universities do and how they waste money, whether this would be that much worse. It may very well be, but I'm actually not at all convinced.
No, but that's
much worse than.
But Alan, yeah, this is compared to the previous president.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It ballooned by 3 times
that does seem
under the previous president. It's not just, public universities are bloated. It's that this guy came in from outside Florida, spent a ton of cash on things that had nothing to do with the actual school, and then dipped.
I have long been a subscriber to the Ben Sasse is overrated club, so I'm happy to have this affirmation of my preconceived notions. If you love Republican Center, go Mitt Romney. Great guy. Love that Mitt Romney. But Ben Sasse, not my flavor, not my cup of tea. And I'm glad to know the alligator feels the same way. Well, I'm going to round out our publication recommendation segment because I am recommending also a Substack, or what we used to call Substacks, by which I mean a magazine, and a particularly newsletter coming from a magazine of all things to bring it full circle. I am a proud subscriber to The Economist. I've subscribed to The Economist since I was 14 or 15 years old. That's impressive because it's ludicrously expensive, which is very frustrating. But I love The Economist. I think it's great. I think it's actually great to get a non-American perspective on a lot of issues. I think Lexington, their column on U.S. politics, although it is now written by an American, is phenomenal. And some of the better writing on U.S. politics. I love every aspect of the magazine. I think I plugged here before that they have phenomenal podcasts, which I totally agree with, most of which are only available to subscribers and are really some of the best coverage of Ukraine and other issues they've come up with, that I found out there. But I wanted to plug here a newsletter that I've really, really been appreciating the last years. That is The War Room. That is their defense coverage. They have a fantastic and incredible defense editor, defense with a C, because it is British and it's so charming that way. Shashank Joshi, who's come on the Lawfare Daily podcast with me before, I think a year or two ago, to talk about Ukraine and technological developments in Ukraine. I need to find an excuse to have him on because he's an incredibly bright, sharp guy and does a phenomenal job curating their defense coverage and producing The War Room, this regular newsletter, that brings it together and supplements it with lots of additional information. I think it's invaluable. It's become really must read for me as I kind of focus in these defense issues and national security issues. And I can't recommend it enough. So if you subscribe to The Economist, you should. If you don't subscribe to The Economist, you should. It's worth the cost, even though it's 30 Substacks or something. And then you get a Substack along with it, a newsletter. So why not? You get the best of both worlds that way. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page, for links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on X or Twitter at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha. On behalf of my co-host, Alan and Quinta, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.